Have you ever looked at your life, your habits, your relationships, your thoughts, and wondered, why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep drowning in relationships that break me, jobs that burn me out, thoughts that eat me alive? Why does peace feel unfamiliar and chaos feel like home? Here's something that might terrify you. Not all addictions are obvious. Some don't come in bottles or needles. Some wear the face of ambition, love, success, even spirituality. They don't scream. They whisper, slowly, daily, quietly restructuring your identity until you no longer know who you are without the dysfunction. These are subconscious addictions, compulsive behaviors driven by unconscious patterns etched deep into your psyche, rooted not just in your childhood, but in your very nervous system. And until you see them, they own every decision you make. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." What we call personality, habit, instinct, might in fact be addiction masquerading as identity. And the moment you realize that is the moment you begin your liberation. Because if you don't bring this to light, these hidden forces will choose your career, your partner, your values, and eventually, your destiny. There are at least 10 destructive subconscious addictions you need to know, not because it's trendy psychology, but because you've probably lived with them your whole life and had no idea they were running the show. You might not be addicted to alcohol, but you might be addicted to chaos, to emotional conflict, to validation. You might say you hate drama, but something inside you keeps inviting it back. That something is a neural imprint, a psychological script playing beneath your consciousness. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility to change it, because your healing depends on it. We've normalized emotional stress to the point where stillness feels foreign. Why? Because if love only showed up in pain during childhood, then your brain associated stress with connection. And when you finally meet a calm, healthy situation, your nervous system says, "This doesn't feel like love." So you unconsciously recreate the only love it remembers, the kind that hurts. And when you're not in crisis, you feel numb. When there's no emotional spike, you feel incomplete. That's not desire. That's emotional addiction. Freud said we are pleasure-seeking beings, but Jung challenged that idea. He believed we seek what is familiar, not necessarily what is pleasurable. Even if what's familiar destroys us, we return to it, because the psyche believes anything familiar is safer than the unknown. This is how you end up calling abuse passion, control care, and anxiety drive. These emotional states become your drug because they give your unconscious mind what it craves most: familiarity. But sometimes it's not the emotion, it's the behavior. Every time you scroll for hours, binge-watch that same show, overwork yourself to the point of exhaustion, you're not just passing time. You're escaping. You're numbing. You're unconsciously choosing a loop instead of a life. You say you're just bored, but boredom is often a disguise for emotional avoidance. The existential discomfort of simply being alone with yourself. When we were young and overwhelmed, we weren't taught introspection. We were taught distraction. So now as adults, we stay in motion not because we're progressing, but because we're afraid that if we stop, the truth might catch up to us. Then there's the prison of your own mind. Maybe it's not your behavior, but your thoughts. The constant catastrophizing, overthinking, replaying arguments that happened years ago. You're not addicted to drama in the outside world. You're addicted to it inside your own mind. Why? Because for many of us, thinking was the only tool we had for safety. When we weren't given trust, we created hypervigilance. When we weren't given clarity, we created overanalysis. Thinking became a shield, but that shield became a cage. You don't need to calculate every possible outcome. You need to feel safe enough to live without trying to predict it all. Now let's talk about relationships. Not the fairy tale ones, but the patterns we keep repeating. You say your type is just bad luck, but what if your type is just your trauma replaying itself in a different body? Have you ever asked yourself why you're attracted to people who hurt you? Why you ignore the red flags and fall for the same emotional dynamic over and over again? That's not a preference. That's an addiction to a specific attachment style that mirrors your childhood. It's not the person you're addicted to. It's the feeling, the emotional roller coaster, the anxiety of the chase, the hope of being enough. Jung theorized about the anima and animus, the unconscious ideals we carry of the opposite gender, formed early in life and projected onto romantic partners later on. You're not falling in love. You're falling into a familiar emotional loop, hoping that maybe this time the story will end differently. But not all addictions look emotional or relational. Some are sensory. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable silence feels? How you always need music, noise, something playing in the background? Even if you're not really listening, that's not preference. That's sensory addiction caused by a nervous system that doesn't know how to feel safe when it slows down. If your nervous system has been on high alert since childhood, peace feels dangerous. Stillness feels like pain because it allows all the repressed emotions to surface. So you drown them out, not with drugs, but with stimulation. Screens, noise, busyness. Jung spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we exile into the unconscious because they were unacceptable. But stillness gives the shadow room to speak, and that terrifies us. And when life gets overwhelming, we return to our default coping methods. At first glance, they look harmless: nail-biting, overeating, procrastination, endless to-do lists. But these behaviors are actually the body's way of saying, I don't know how to soothe myself, so I loop what's familiar. These are not just bad habits. They are ritualized responses to unprocessed stress. Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose. Subconscious addiction closes that space. Conscious awareness reopens it. But sometimes the addiction isn't to the real world, but to escape from it. Fantasy, daydreams, idealized realities where you're safe, seen, loved, powerful. And if those daydreams become your default reality, you are not just imagining, you're avoiding. You're shielding against the heartbreak of the present by disappearing into a fiction of the future. This is common in adults who grew up in unpredictable or emotionally barren homes. They mentally escaped because they physically couldn't. So now their mind still retreats the same way. You don't need to kill your imagination, but you might need to reclaim your presence. And what happens when none of that is enough? You turn to adrenaline, but not in the way you think. You constantly chase high-stakes situations. You subconsciously provoke crises. You find thrill in danger, and you call it passion. But it's not passion. It's panic dressed up as aliveness. When you've been emotionally numb for most of your life, anxiety becomes your vitality. You fill your calendar with deadlines, your schedule with drama, because that's the only time you feel something. Carl Jung believed that when we ignore the shadow, it finds a way to manifest in our outer world. Maybe the chaos isn't happening to you. Maybe it's being summoned by the parts of you that don't know any other way to feel real. Then there's the craving of all cravings, validation, the invisible drug of modern life. Likes on social media, praise at work, constant approval from partners, friends, strangers. You say you're just ambitious. But what if your ambition is actually a search for worth? You grind because someone once made you feel like you weren't enough. And every like, every compliment becomes a tiny hit of psychological oxygen. Erich Fromm warned us, when we base our identity on external validation, we lose the ability to simply be. We turn ourselves into products, polished, photoshopped, performative, hoping someone somewhere will finally say, you're enough. But the truth? Until you believe that inside yourself, no amount of praise will ever make you feel whole. And finally, the most disguised addiction of all, control. You make your bed perfectly. You plan every detail. You obsess over every outcome. But that's not peace. That's fear with a spreadsheet. Underneath control is often a child who once felt powerless, whose needs were ignored, whose world felt chaotic. And now they control everything, not because they're strong, but because they think it's the only way to feel safe. Jung said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but control is the psyche's attempt to bypass that terror. It's trying to fix the external world to numb the internal chaos. Have you ever felt like you're haunted by versions of yourself that you never chose? Like no matter how far you grow, some invisible thread keeps pulling you back to the same patterns. Why does no one talk about how healing isn't just about becoming, but about grieving? Grieving the behaviors that protected you. Grieving the versions of yourself that emerged out of necessity. Grieving how much of your life you lived on autopilot because your body was still fighting battles your mind had already forgotten. We are not addicted to these patterns because we are broken. We are addicted to them because at one time they saved us. They gave us order in chaos. They gave us identity in confusion. They gave us a sense of self, even if it was false. But now is the time to put those illusions down, not with shame, but with compassion. Rewiring your brain doesn't begin with effort. It begins with vision, with awareness, with choosing presence over projection, with replacing conditioned responses with conscious ones. The path is hard, but the reward, it's peace, it's authenticity, it's the joy of no longer being ruled by pain. If you've made it this far, I want to know who truly understood the message. Leave the phrase "addiction hides in patterns" in the comments. And let's see how many of you really grasp what it means to reclaim your mind, your story, and your freedom. If this video made you feel seen, if it made you rethink your patterns, like and subscribe, because this is just the beginning. I'll see you in the next video. And remember, unconscious patterns don't disappear. They just disguise themselves as your personality.